Okay, welcome back to our conference. Thanks for attending, thanks for coming. It's a special pleasure for me to welcome Nishant Shah to our conference. Thanks for being here, thanks for participating. He will be our keynote speaker for today, and I'm really looking forward to your lecture where we will be able to contextualize some of the things we just heard from a curatorial and artistic perspective as well on the digital identity. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me introduce you briefly to Nishant. Nishant Shah is the co-founder of the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore, India, and he's working at the moment as a professor at the Institute. He is a professor at the Institute for Culture and Aesthetic of Digital Media at Leuphana University in Lüneburg. He works in multi-stakeholder environments at the intersections of digital technologies, identities, politics, gender, and sexuality. So welcome to our conference. It's a pleasure for us. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Nishant.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation and to share some of the work that's ongoing right now. I've just come back from India after spending 6 weeks doing fieldwork. And I thought this would be the most perfect opportunity to actually present it because, as we all know, India and Germany are exactly the same. I'll come to that later as a part of my presentation. But I want to thank Fabian and Judith for inviting me, for giving such... It's always great to have curatorial feedback about what's expected because then I actually know what I'm going to speak about as opposed to coming and rambling. And I love it when people invite me as an academic because it allows me to do this. It allows me to produce slides like these. Right? This is proof that I am indeed an academic. Look, I made a boring slide, all right? But I promise it's going to get more interesting from here. But I do want to use this very basic slide in order to maybe propose that the ways in which we understand the notion of the self is an informational model of the self. And I'm going to spend some time talking about this idea of an informational self and what it can mean, right? Which is to say that we define and understand the self through the transmission, transaction, storage, sorting, sifting, and negotiation of information. That when we talk about the self, we often think about it in our relationship with information. And so you get like a public self, a private self, a personal self, and all of it is premised on what kind of information is it going to produce and what is the kind of information it's going to be able to negotiate with, right? So I don't have a thesis on subjectivity or identity, but on an informational self, which I'm going to propose is at the basis of the ways in which we understand contemporary social sciences, politics, questions of justice, rights, inclusion, and so on. Right? And let me quickly run you through some of the different kinds of narratives of this informational self, which have been around and which I'm sure are extremely familiar to all of us. So one of the first models that we know of is the critique which is posited that the conception of the informational self is about the ability and the agency, the choice and the consent to produce narratives of ourselves. So not to be objects of which stories are told, but our humanity's understanding of human beings as storytellers, right? The capacity of us to control what are the stories which are going to be told about us. My rights in this particular model of control narrative is the model where I have the ability to say that this is my information, this is where I want to disclose it, and I own the rights to producing it. So the minute I give this to you, you can think of a range of different devices, questions of representation, questions of intellectual property rights, questions of justice, questions of equality, all get premised on this notion of the informational self, which is a self which has a control over the information that's being produced for it. Right? And that's like a standard model that we're already familiar with. The second one, which is about the self and the ownership of information, is slightly perhaps nuanced. Then it talks not merely about my conditions to produce reality or my condition to produce information, but also my necessary right or a sense of entitlement of owning it. In many ways, this is the property model, right? Like just like I own property, I can also own my information. And my information allows me then to decide who gets to share it, who is encroaching on it, who is not allowed to squat on it without my permission. And these are all spatial metaphors that we use in understanding our relationships with information as well. It also enables to think of ourself as a commodity, so that we think about ourself as something that is in a space of transaction and trading. However, we still have control over this property that we call the self, and we get to decide what its values or meanings are going to be at different instances, right? So this is the second one, which is about the self as ownership of information. The third one, which becomes slightly more radical perhaps, is the informational self, which is posited as an inalienable right, which is to say that myself cannot be extricated from myself, right? It's a very, very nice composition, that the self is residing so deep within my interiority and subjectivity, but it's also tied to practices of bodily dignity, of survival, of different kinds of negotiations of my body, and that a lot of it is mediated by the information that we produce around ourselves. So we are entitled to the self, we are bound to it, we define ourselves through it, and while we might agree to disclose and share it, we need to be in control of where this informational self travels, what it is used for, and who it is used by. That even if we have shared ourselves, sometimes with friends, sometimes with corporations, sometimes with governments, it does not mean that anybody can use it for any purpose, because it's inalienably who I am, and it's embedded in my very condition of being an identity, right? So that a use of my information without consent or against my intention is not merely an information breach, but it's also a violation of my very selfhood. And that we have always conflated these two particular ideas, and which is why our informational governance systems have the human self at its very center, where our laws are not about protecting information, but about protecting the individual whose information is being violated. Because there is a very clear idea that the informational self is an inalienable self. In all of these three models, there is a clear idea that our relationship with information then defines who we are. We are informational subjects. That is to say that we are subjects of information and we are subject to information. And our negotiations with information actually define who we are going to be. That our negotiation with information, our sense of control, our possibility of entering into a state of interpretation, and our ownership of that information and what happens to it gives us a sense of ourself. And any abuse of this information, hence, in its form, in its format, or even in its functions, produces a sense of violation. And I wanted to stick with this informational privacy model because this has been at the basis of our understanding of the individual self and has informed our politics around safeguarding, managing, and regulation of the self through the discourse of rights, responsibilities, and entitlements. The collectives that we form, so communities and societies, for instance, are predicated on this. Our ideas of interpersonal relationships, who we love, who we live with, and how we interpret how we live and love with people are also informed by this. It is a model that's also shaped by the transmission technologies that have produced this information, and that model, in fact, completely structures our social and political, but also neighborly conversations. And I want to stick with the neighborly conversations because coming to Germany has been quite a revelation. I have never signed a contract with neighbors trying to figure out how we are going to live together in two separate houses. Right? I'm not allowed to cook after a certain period of time. I'm not allowed to wash clothes after a certain period of time. I'm only allowed guests during a certain period of time, and so on. And I want to take this example as how informational selves and societies actually get constructed. So I have a neighbor who roughly looks like this on a good day. And this is a story that I thought is worth telling, right? So my neighbor, who's a law student, had a late night party 3 nights in a row last month. The party was loud with much music, merriment, and laughter. I have another neighbor upstairs who strangely also knows my name and he talks to me once in a while. And he knocked on my door at 11 in the night one of these days. And he asked me if I am bothered by the noise next door. I come from India. I mean, this was like a daily routine, right? Like, this didn't even sound like noise, for God's sake. So I just shrugged my shoulders and said, you know, it is what it is. I have really nice noise cancellation headphones. I'm wearing them. I'm fine. And he said, I'm unable to read and concentrate. What do I do? And then I said, you know, you might just want to knock on his door and say, listen, it's too loud. And he got horrified. He said, I can't possibly do that. That's a huge sense of violation, isn't it? Like, I can't invade or encroach upon this particular person's informational rights or self to just let him know that he needs to tone it down. So then I said, well, I don't know what else to do. And then he very gruffly he looked at me and said, I know exactly what to do. He went home, he called the cops. And cops came and shut the party down in the next door house, right? But this is the informational model of the self, where the way to talk to our neighbors is through the central structure that will broadcast information and also take a call on what value it has. This informational model then is not just about the self and its negotiation with information, but the ways in which you and I are going to talk to each other in our interpretations and mitigations with the information as well. And I want to kind of talk about an Indian playwright called Mahesh Dattani, who has interestingly produced like an entire body of work, which is a thesis on violence and its irrational interruption. And he has a fascinating story which he once in an interview said he wanted to turn into a play, but he never quite figured out how to do it, right? So it's a story which was meant to be a play, but it's not. And this is the story in the 1950s, where the Indian state, as an informational state to its informational selves, had made manifest itself through the radio. The All India Radio, which is in Hindi called Akashvani, which literally means voice from the sky, was the voice of the state, and reception of it made you into an informational subject, but also an informational citizen. And in Maharashtra, Dattani says, the state where Mumbai is, there was a small village community that heard on the radio that the state had offered subsidies and financial aid to the community that formed that village. They were extremely overjoyed, and they went to the district collector's office and said, we've just heard from the state on the radio that you are supposed to give us this amount of money. The district collector's office looked at them and said, no. It escalated. It became really, really problematic, because here were people who said that they had read the information, and the district collector's office was saying, no, you have read the information wrong. Yeah? It reached a point where 150 villagers got together, locked everybody up in the district collector's office, and burnt them to death. They were burned to death in the 1950s. And the entire thing was about the capacity to read information, the production of ourselves as informational citizens or subjects, and the sense of violation of the self, and the lack of entitlement that we feel when we are not allowed to interpret, make meaning, or negotiate with information that we think defines very centrally who we are. Right? So I want to raise the stakes. I want to raise the stakes that informational selves are not merely about censoring of information and whether we should be watching porn and cats or not, but that there is something fundamentally structural in the ways in which our sense of self is defined by our informational realities and different kinds of materialities that come around it. So through both these cases of my noisy neighbor as well as the villagers who, decided to burn an entire office down, I'm suggesting that there is an informational model, a set of regulations and protocols that define the nature of information and our relationship with it, and through that sense, our sense of who we are. And my proposition today is that this informational model has changed with the emergence of the digital. That the individual who was at the center of the informational model has been reconceptualized in new ways, and that some of our current questions around privacy, around rights, around justice, have often not yet taken account of the shift, and hence often faces a deadlock in our demands for protection of the self in the age of database governance and digital networks. And I want to illustrate this through two examples from one of the largest exercises of biometric database creation in India. The project that India has launched is called Aadhaar, which is the Hindi word for support, and is right now a biometric system that provides the infrastructure for e-governance in India. Before I go into a description of it, I thought I'd actually show you at least a small clip of the government's own representation of this project. Unfortunately, I can't find a video with with English subtitles, so we're just going to have to watch it in Hindi. And I'm going to play it for a little bit with the music and the sound, and then I'm just going to silent it and talk over it.
शुरू नई उड़ान, मिली हमें पहचान, खुले नए अब द्वार, हमारा आधार 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 आधार, ये है मेरी पहचान, ये है मेरी पहचान।
अपने अपने नाम आएगा, कदम कदम पर काम आएगा, हर पल हर दम साथ रहेगा।
Okay, so I'm just going to mute it. This is just an example of why India and Germany are the same. Because whenever the state makes video, it always looks like this. It's bizarre beyond belief, and you can't recognize your own country in it. Yeah. So I'm going to let the video run, and I'm going to speak over it for some time. So self-described as a pro-poor, pro-development, anti-corruption system that shall lead to efficient distribution of public resources by providing a unique identifier to the people of India, Aadhaar has had many different iterations and versions. It began as a project under the aegis of the Unique Identification Authority of India, or the UIDAI, and was presented as a voluntary enrollment system which allowed people to have access to verifiable transactions and services. So when Aadhaar in its initial stages came up, it was a process of identification, a yes-no mechanism that would verify that the person presenting themselves to a system is the person who the system thinks it should be. It collected a cursory amount of personal information and biometric data, and then offered a verification system which would allow for the residents of India to interact with various public and private systems that work through a centralized database where this information resides. And the video kind of keeps on showing you all these different services in rural India, in different kinds of poor communities which are not very well connected, and how they are going to interact with it. But in our informational model then, this seems like a fairly straightforward process, where the database, or the Aadhaar governance database, is a narration of the individual's characteristics through a database logic. This is the production of what we sometimes call the data subject, where the individual is the external entity that needs to be mined for information, which can then be stored in the database. The database is an extraction and abstraction of the individual, and structures the messy reality that our cells are standardized into as clean and legible data sets. I thought the conversation in the morning was fascinating when they said that the only solution to not having enough data is to have more data, right? You just need more clean human beings, more clean people that we can kind of mine and abstract information from. So the data subject is a verificatory mechanism for a system. You said, this is who you are. Our system says, this is who you are. Hence, surprise, you must be who you are saying you are. I have a very nerdy joke to tell you, and I don't know how many people will laugh at it. Please don't. But this seems to mimic exactly the ways in which the TCP/IP protocol, for example, functions. So do you know what happens when the TCP/IP protocol walks into a bar? It says, hi, I want a beer. And the bartender says, hi, you want a beer? And the TCP/IP protocol says, hi, I want a beer. And then it walks out, right? This is exactly how data subjects operate when it comes to database systems. The presumption is that the database is a representation of this individual, and it is a description of that individual. The presumption is that the data subject is the same as the informational self, and protecting the data is to protect the self as well. This database then needs to be protected so that the information in it is safe, that we are in control of this information, that we get to choose what happens to this information, and that it needs to be protected from somebody using that data against our will and intention. However, this particular narrative of keeping the data subject safe through keeping the data protected has a strange punctuation from the Aadhaar story. This is a story of a community at Nurpur, which is in Diamond Harbour in Kolkata, in East India. East India, but in West Bengal, don't ask. Where residents were issued wrong information on their Aadhaar cards. So consistently through a combination of human and machine errors, these residents were issued cards which then collated their information incorrectly. As a result of this, many residents were unable to access public delivery services, including the collection of subsidized food, from the local food stations. When they went to these local shops, the mismatch in the information excluded them from the very services that Aadhaar was supposed to facilitate, right? Because the system was saying you are not who you say you are because the database says no. In this particular case, in anger, they took to violence and to protest, only to realize that the verification system in that first iteration was not even made for corrections. There was just no way possible within the database system because the database had not imagined the necessity to correct itself if it met a use case where things are going to go wrong. Because as far as the database logic is concerned, once you have claimed for yourself a particular identity, the system can only verify that, and any changes that might occur, even due to errors, is not the problem of the system but that of the individual. Or in other words, the data subject is no longer about the relationship of the data with individual, like we had with information with the individual. It is not a verification of the data through the individual, which is again what happens in information. You are saying this. How can I trust you that what you are saying is right? And you say, because it's about me, and I'm saying it, and hence when I say it, it must be right. Whereas in this particular system, so it's not a verification of the data through the individual, but the other way around, where the individual is not, if not verified, becomes non-existent, right? This shift from the individual as a source of information to data as a source of defining the individual is new, and it's worth kind of dwelling upon for a certain time, because the unverified individual is no longer an individual who can be accepted. For example, if I lose my work permit in Germany from the welcome immigrant, I will immediately become an unwelcome refugee. And it takes only that much time. It takes only one set of data from the database to be deleted for me to become an unverified or an unwelcome person in a different country. The control over this data, the form of narration that the database produces, is now in the hands of algorithms. And while we continue to demand protection of data, the human usage of data, and the protection about the usage of data, we haven't been very vocal in demanding of the protection of the individual from the data subject. That the data subject, in fact, seems to have emerged to become such a dominant reality that the real experiences and the narratives of the subject and control of information are now made completely redundant. So my first proposition is that we need to think of data protection and the self-protection in a different mode. Not about keeping the data safe, but keeping the authority and autonomy of data subjects in check, where your data subject is not you. The data subject is the subject that's created in the database that's available to you. And we need to be able to talk about how we shall protect ourselves from the data subject which has been created out there. Because while the informational self was a description of the individual, the data subject is a prescription of the individual. And that this shift needs to be registered in the kind of demands that we are making in talking about the agency of defining who we are and the ability to negotiate with the production of this data subject, which is not given to an algorithm, which doesn't use of ourselves as verification systems, but resides within the human, who is otherwise, in the database logic again, considered to be fallible, corrupt, and ambiguous. The second story I want to tell you is a continuation of these ideas and also gives me the title for today's talk. And this is my favorite story from the field that I've ever come across. And this is the picture of a dog who has an Aadhaar card. And this is not an art project. It's not a hoax. It's an actual card which has been issued in the country, right? This is literally the card, and I've just removed personal information from it, which has now been given to a dog. And I find the dog fascinating because somewhere down the line, the Aadhaar card moved from being a voluntary enrollment resident system to a mandatory registration citizen system, right? So, or in other words, the Aadhaar, which was supposed to be a system of identification, of verifying that you match up to your data subject, quickly became a system of identity production. It determined who you are and predicted what routes you can take in your everyday lives when mediated by this, that only a citizen of India could have an Aadhaar card. And by corollary, it means that anybody who has an Aadhaar card surely should be a citizen of the country. And in effect, it means that the dog might very well be the first non-human citizen of the country, right? And it's interesting because this is not just a card which was a glitch, which could be just neglected as something that's not important, because this card has also been used in transactions. It has been used by a real life person who has walked into shops and banks, producing this card and the associated number and identifiers in order to perform a series of transactions. So while it's easy to dismiss this as a glitch or an error, what we want to pay attention is how this particular card was not a problem to the operationalization system of Aadhaar, right? That even when the person wielding the card was obviously and hopefully not looking like that, the card in itself was not an error for the system. It was a system error only for the individual who was concerned. And I call this another model, the model of the quantified self. Right? So if the data subject was about consolidating and collecting information from the individual and creating a profile for the self, then the quantified self is about a set of relationships which are established between the different data sets of the individual itself. Again, not about you and your data, but the relationship between the different data sets which can be emerged out of you. The Aadhaar number, for example, interacts with banking and financial agents, health and insurance services, telecommunication networks, public planning databases, and so on. And each time the Aadhaar number performs an act of identification, it also creates a part of your identity. It shares, collates, correlates, and constructs new media data identities which count you beyond and outside the database that the Aadhaar creates. The dog Aadhaar card, thus, has no problem in opening a bank account. So this is how I encountered it. I was doing interviews with banking officials, and I came across a file which has this Aadhaar card as the primary bank holder, right? And I looked at them and said, isn't this a problem? And they said, of course not, because the number matches and the biometrics match, right? And that's all that we require. So the Aadhaar system is not then about identifying the subject, but about providing the subject with an identity. Or in other words, the Aadhaar is not about verifying that you are you, but is actually about circulating your data through different networks of traffic so that your own knowledge of you is superseded by the correlations which are made between the different data sets. The dog on that card is nothing more than an abstraction of you, and the real you resides in the different transactions that the dog card catalyzes. Your own agency about control of your information and transparency is limited to your data subject. So the Aadhaar authorities reassure us over and over again that your information is safe because your data subject is safe. Your information is safe because your quantified self is safe, but we no longer need to take into account what is your problem or your condition of safety. Yeah? That we will make sure that the ways in which your data is created and stored is safe, the ways in which relationships between them are made is safe, but not about the human safety at all. However, what they hide is how this data actually is only a catalyst that initiates a data accrual process that is beyond our reach and impossible to fathom. The ways in which the data travels, the connections it makes, the things that it remembers, and the memories it stores creates a predictive model of who you are as opposed to merely representing who you think you are. So going back to Bill Watterson and his iconic strip, on the internet nobody knows if you are a dog. As long as you are an entity whose data can initiate transactions, it will create narratives of you in ways and forms that you cannot access. And so I'm suggesting that on the digital network, nobody cares if you are a human. All you need to be is this information, not this informational self that we have constructed in the information model, but this digital self which is dissipated and distributed through the data subject, through the quantified self that travels through different circuits and tells stories like your best friend betraying you, like your mom talking behind your back, to other data sets and databases constructing narratives that you cannot know exist and thus cannot negotiate with. With the data self and the quantified self, the digital then brings together a new model of understanding the individual, which is not the informational self, but what I'm trying to call the computational self. The computational self thinks of the individual as atomic, as split, as fragmented, as something that can be coded and consolidated in a database. The computational self treats the individual as a networked self, as something that emerges out of making connections and relationships between different data sets, and in both the cases, the informational self is both helpless and largely redundant. We do not have that self as we have understood it easily available in contemporary times. What we have is the self both as a network of datasets and a networked entity. The demands then that we make of the concerns of consent, property, rights, control, privacy are completely overridden by this computational self. And as activists and advocates, we often encounter deadlocks while making these demands for the safety of the computational self. Because we go back to this notion of the informational self as the basis. When we think of our protecting our privacy, for example, through protecting our data sets, we overlook the predictive possibilities of the quantified self, and the fact that we are no longer sole authors of our information. In recognizing this changing nature of the individual from the informational self to the computational self, with the data subject and the quantified self as two kind of placeholders in the beginning, I'm suggesting that we might have the possibility and the need to produce a new vocabulary of creating safeguards for protection and mitigation. And we need to realize that this configuration of the individual has direct consequences on our conceptions of equality, justice, inclusion, rights, and privacy. And the demands that we make of these systems need to accommodate for the new logic and logistics of these computational networks. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nishant. Are there any comments, remarks, questions? We have time now for a discussion, so please feel free to ask your questions.
So what do you suggest?
I thought I just made a series of suggestions.
Oh, yeah, but how would you conceptualize this?
In terms of operationalizing next steps, I don't have a prescriptive model because, as you can see, I'm against it. But I do have three interesting inroads into rethinking this relationship. The first is that within the informational set or the informational self model, which was based on the notion of communication transmission models, where there was a clearly identified centralized structure that we are talking to, through, and against, we need to now start realizing that in the computational self model, we are dealing with a digital network where there are nodes, which means that the state, which was, for example, at the center of our communication discourse, merely becomes one of the stakeholders as opposed to the central stakeholder to which we have to respond to. Yeah. So the introduction of different kinds of players, which is sometimes called public-private partnership, for instance, is to realize that this is no longer an informational self model, that we are dealing with multiple nodes which are constantly operating and sharing of data which is way beyond what one individual node can imagine. So that's one. Just as a mere critique of contemporary government systems, it becomes important to say that our idea of the government was premised on the informational self, and because the informational self has changed, the government has also changed, and it's time to kind of take account for it. The second, and perhaps this might be more interesting for people who are on the field and doing activism, is to start realizing that the informational self was always a consolidated self, whereas the computational self is necessarily a fragmented self, which means that you do not have now the capacity to author or authoritatively claim a narrative about you, because it will be superseded by different kinds of profiles which are made around you, right? So how do we think of our subjects and keeping them safe is something that's crucial. Like I do some work with activists, for example, who work in more authoritarian regimes, and it's kind of ghastly when somebody goes to them and saying, oh, all you need in Iran is right now to have another Facebook or a Twitter revolution, because what you haven't understood is that Twitter and Facebook are not merely identification systems but also identity systems, and that they are going to produce narratives of you by sharing data sets which are way beyond your capacity. And the third, which is a conceptual distinction which has been useful, is to maybe make a distinction between probability and possibility, where probability is in the domain of things which have already happened, and because there is a pattern of things which have already happened, it will happen again. And we have to realize that computational selves are probable selves. They are based entirely on things that you have already done, creating patterns out of it and hence creating a profile of it. But if it is a system of probability, then it means that it is interested in closing out the possibilities of things which have not been happened simply by calling it abuse, simply by criminalizing or pathologizing those practices because they have not happened and they should not happen because they are counterintuitive to the logic of the computational system itself. Right? So these are 3 entry points I have, but I'm hoping that there will be many more different ways of dealing with this question. Thank you.
Here's another question.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I just tried to formulate my question. I could really very easily follow you, but I asked myself whether the separation you are suggesting to make between the computational self and the informational self is really so strict, because I think that the system, the data system, only that the data system needs a kind of a combination between the two of them to move, to move and to live on, so to say. Because I remember very situation in which I happened to fall out of the system.
Oh no.
Yes, and then it was not just really could be fixed. Yes, but then the woman who explained me that the data do not match, what my situation was. She said to me, yes, it is not your fault, but now it is your problem.
Yes.
And it is your problem means you have to solve it. It is up to you to find a solution. And I think that we are all the time just, doing that, finding new solution in order to make the system work. And I think this kind of interplay between what you called informational self and computational self is absolutely necessary to make the system kind of run. So
I think that's a great input, and thank you very much, because this is not a call about how we are moving from informational to computational, but that we are sometimes mistaking the computational self for the informational self. And that it's necessary to make an explicit model of this particular space because they are going to coexist. There are points of transitions and intersections which might... So my favorite story about this is always about Jimmy Wales, who is one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, right? And Jimmy came to Bangalore in 2008 and he told us the story about how Jimmy Wales has a Wikipedia page, right? And on the Wikipedia page, somebody wrote that Jimmy Wales is intelligent, blah, blah, blah. In his free time, he likes to play chess. Now, he hates playing chess. Like he actively dislikes it. So he goes onto the Wikipedia page and he edits it and he says, no, I don't like playing chess. At which somebody came and said, who are you to say that you don't like playing chess? At which Jimmy said, it's me. I'm saying I don't like playing chess. This person went into an interview that he had given somewhere where the interviewer had said that Jimmy Wales likes playing chess and saying, here is evidence which speaks against you by Wikipedia's own logic. Wikipedia is not an informational system. It is completely a computational system. Everything that you say has to be verified by something which is not a human. So Jimmy, in fact, then 1 year later, when he is on the cover of Times magazine, in that very serious interview about the values of Wikipedia, says, I particularly want to mention that I really dislike playing chess. And then he has to wait for a year to use that as a reference to go and edit his Wikipedia page and saying, there, it's now been solved.
yes, but it was he, who solved it.
Indeed.
Who initiated the change.
Indeed, and I think so that's why I was saying that the relationship of governance needs to be different now. Because if in the informational model, any problem that happened in the informational landscape is the central authority's problem. That you could go to the state and saying, this is not working, change it. Whereas now it is not your fault, but as you very elegantly put it, it is your problem. And your capacity to now interpret, negotiate, or ask for safeguards has drastically reduced. And that all you can do is deal with databases and ask for different kinds of rights, right? So it's that continuum that we need to be constantly working with, definitely. But thank you.
Here's another question. Yeah. Thanks for that, Nishant. A lot in there to kind of work my head around, I guess. The one thing I got out of
Read my book.
Yes. When is it out?
In a year and a half.
Well, in the meantime, I'm wondering, because it seems to me that part of what you're saying is that the kind of default strategies of politics of kind of the informational self don't really work in the computational or self or in that age, or need to be translated somehow. That translation is really what we've been missing for a long time in relation also to governance. What strikes me is that I'm trying to figure that out, and a lot of it seems to be about we have to kind of learn we have to kind of become database experts. We have to understand how these databases work, and we need actually. So that's the one thing. Is that where we're going? That we all have to kind of start reading books about databases to understand how these works, which kind of asks. It's always an interesting challenge coming from like a media theorist and information scientist to say you guys need to become informaticians or computer scientists ultimately if you want to have an understanding of governance. So that's the one question. The other question is there people who are doing work on this, to actually trying to kind of map this out for us? Because obviously I'm going to despair if I read a book of computer science about databases. But there seems to be a very specific analysis that's necessary to see how all these kinds of databases work, connect, and so on. So in government, but also in corporations and so on.
So, you already know my answer to the first one, saying, of course, everybody should build their own computer. But no, I'm just being facetious. No, I don't think the answer is in digital hardware and software literacy. Because that would be the equivalent of saying that anybody who does film studies needs to know how to make a film exactly. And we have known historically that anybody who is a good film critic should not make a film. Because when they make it, they're like nightmares, right? Even their loved ones don't want to watch it. So no, I don't think it's true. I mean, I can give you a list. But the point is not to learn how to build a database, but that we need to understand the database as a techno-social or a techno-cultural artifact. That we have long shied away from thinking about digital and computational technologies as merely technological and given away the control to somebody else. We don't do that with our books. We don't do that with our radios, and we don't do that with our TVs. We have a specific understanding of how this information circulates and flows. And because the informational model has so many different cultural instances, we are able to decode them in some ways. So no, you don't need to read a computer science textbook, though sometimes it can be fun. But it is important to at least look at the philosophy of computing. Right? That's something that's been missing out of even digital cultures or cyberculture spaces. That we haven't spent enough time thinking about what does a database do or what does a database think beyond looking at the visualization of a database. And that it's necessary to bring out those logics and logistics of computation back into our work. And at least my hunch is that we might actually be better at doing that than the computer scientists. Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge worth taking up. About the second one, I think there is definitely a new range of practitioners, not so much as academics, who are working towards this. So in Germany, the organization that immediately comes to my mind is Tactical Technologies, which is located in Berlin. And Tactical Tech has been incredible because since '99, what they have been doing is they have been trying to work with activists and grassroots organizers across the global south and in more authoritarian regimes to understand what happens to your data, which is different from what happens to your information. Just recognizing what are the ways in which data is different from information, for example, has been interesting enough. Similarly, different kinds of summer schools. I think the Open Society Foundation has been doing incredible work in doing capacity building for bureaucrats and policy actors to understand that the informational structure of governance that they are used to is not as much in a state of crisis as it's in a state of transition. And then kind of bringing the digital, or let me put it this way, rescuing the digital from the interface, right? like rescuing the visual imperative that the digital has kind of provided to us, because all we can think of when we think of the digital is the GUI, might be the step. That it's necessary to literally scratch at your screen and look at what's happening beneath that. To take Wendy's wonderful idea that Wendy Chern is a software studies a scholar, and she has this wonderful formulation where she says that the more transparent our devices become, the more opaque they become. Yeah? And it's time to break that opacity. It's time to scratch beneath the surface and see what's happening in there. And it can be code, and it can be networking, and we don't need to understand that language, but we definitely can understand the mechanisms beyond which it's happening. Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Remark? Yeah, please.
Yeah, my question is more philosophical, I think, but I ask myself if the
computational self.
Computational
I know it's a
self,
bad word. I need to find
yeah.
something else for it.
Okay. Is it maybe just another representation form of an anthropological problem, that there's always a break between identity and
Experience?
or the identity I have and the human being I am, and yet is it another thing, or?
No, I think that's a great question, and thank you, because it allows me to add something which I didn't have the time to for the talk, and that's why Q&A is so nice. I can talk. I want to, as opposed to read. I want to hang on to the word that you use, which is representation, right? And representation is firmly and philosophically and aesthetically an informational category. It talks about information's capacity to stand in for you, to be surrogate for you, to be negotiating, and so on. So even within the informational self, we always had the discrepancy between who I am and what my identity is. But there was a capacity to negotiate between the two, interpret between the two, and my sovereign self was still the final answer in this is who I am. Yeah, that is how at least the imagined subjectivity of the informational self is. The computational self is actually non-representational in nature because it is a product of simulation as opposed to representation. Your data does not represent you. The data has no interest in representing you. The data merely seeks to prescribe a model which you should be able to follow, and hence it constantly simulates the conditions that you could have. In which case, because it is a simulated self, or it's a self which arises from simulation, and I'm not using simulation in terms of 3D rendering, graphic, and so on, right? But simulation as a conceptual category that brings the non-material into the material, so to speak, that brings something into space which did not exist outside of that system. In this case, your negotiation power are now next to zero. So Facebook might believe that you are X, Y, and Z, and you might have no correlation with it, but you have no capacity to interact or negotiate with it, A, because Facebook won't even tell you what it knows about you. Yeah, that simulated self, which is the data subject and the quantified self, is nothing to do with you. You are merely in a post-apocalyptic matrix kind of a phenomenon. You are merely an information pod. And that information is no longer in a representational aesthetic, but in a simulated aesthetic. And the computational self then has to be thought of as a production of those processes of simulation, as opposed to subject to the logics of representation. And that might be just an interesting distinction to make between the two. Yeah? Thank you.
There's another question over there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you as well. It was a very interesting talk. And I think I'd like to point in one direction which you already mentioned, which is biometrics.
Mm-hmm.
Which I really am really interested in how you would describe the body or the like fingerprint, the eye print, and all this stuff, which also becomes a prescription of yourself, which kind of makes or pretends that your body is a stable thing, which is not changing at all, which is of course not. And how this as a how you would place the body in your computer self.
Thank you. I think biometrics is actually the prime example where this contradiction plays out, right? Because in the Aadhaar system, for instance, we find it super hilarious. So has everybody ever given biometrics your fingerprints in the room? All right. Has it ever happened that it could not read your biometrics or your fingerprint? Yeah? It did, Kuan? Where?
My hands were too big.
Your hands were too big. Okay. So obviously the Dutch were not designed to be the normative subjects of it, right? But in India, when they went in with the Aadhaar, they suddenly did not realize that the pro-poor system was dealing with poor people who don't have fingerprints. If you do manual labor 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day for 10 years of your life, your fingerprints are completely eroded. And so you keep on going to these villages and saying, give us fingerprints, and then they were not legible systems, right? So this prescription is not merely about what your body is going to be, but what happens if you have the kind of body that my system cannot read is that you again become an unverified individual in that. You can very easily start tracing a certain kind of a post-colonial narrative in this, because when the British came to India holding calipers to our heads, trying to figure out if our skulls are large enough to be intelligent and humans or not, they were trying to say the same thing. That if you are not going to be measured up, right? So from a system of measuring, it becomes a system that you have to measure up to. And the minute that system becomes the standard, it becomes your problem and how you want to kind of interact with it. So biometrics have been fascinating through this. There are some great artistic interventions, for example, which have looked at replacing biometrics with smiles. Saying if you are in a grumpy mood, your laptop will not open up because you are not smiling. So if you want to unlock your laptop, you have to smile at it. Except that, if you're grumpy and you're looking at your laptop and it's not opening, you just get grumpier. You don't really smile, and so it just keeps on locking the system up more and more. But those kinds of contradictions are definitely worth kind of playing through.
I think we have time for one last question. Kuhn, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, it connects a little bit with this question, and you already also partly answered. By the way, great fan of your work. It's great to see you in person.
Thank you.
I was thinking, because also being a more optimistic person, I was thinking, where is the room for negotiation between the informational and the computational self? And can we think of our bodies and our affects and emotions perhaps as a source to kind of counter this, or perhaps as a room for maneuver and negotiation? Thinking back to the panel yesterday where it was mentioned that affect and our emotions is like the next frontier of computation and modification. And how could we perhaps think of affect and emotion in between the informational and computational cell as a way of... Is there a twitch there that we can...
So I know that it doesn't sound like that from my presentation, but I'm also an optimistic person. I think this is the right time to kind of figure out where those spaces of negotiation are going to be. So one of the things that I have found inspiring, for example, is to find correlations between human rights activism and open source activism and see what happens when you put the two of them together. Because the sacredness with which open source activists treat code, if we only could invest so much sacredness in how we treat the human body, it would have just been so much a happier space to live in. The amount of regulation that is put into place to protect our data, if the same kind of regulation could be transferred to protecting the people that we deal with, it would be an interesting idea. So in fact, after making this separation between the data and the individual, I think the way forward is to force the two of them together and say that because data is so easily a commodity and has capitalistic value, you are more interested in protecting it, the same safeguards will have to be offered to the humans whose data you are so busy protecting. Right? So this crossover between digital rights activism and civil rights activism, for me, is one of the way forwards. That this is where the two need to meet now, and that we need to be able to figure out what will happen if we don't want to build merely open societies, but open source societies.
Thank you so much for your brilliant and inspiring lecture, Nishant. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Thank you.